Welcome to today's deep dive. I'm genuinely so thrilled you're joining us today
Absolutely.
because we are going on a journey that has been meticulously, entirely custom tailored for you.
Yeah, we've really dug into this one.
We have. And knowing you and knowing your grasp of history, I am well aware that you already know the basics of World War I.
Right.
Like when we mention the Great War, we don't need to lecture you about the tragedy of the Somme.
Or Verdun.
Exactly, the meat grinder of Verdun, or those static, muddy trenches stretching across France, lined with barbed wire.
The standard textbook stuff.
You already know the textbook picture of the Western Front,
Mm-hmm.
but we were setting that standard narrative aside today.
Completely aside.
What if I told you that the grand strategy of this conflict, the war that violently dragged the world into the 20th century, was dictated by events far beyond those infamous trenches?
It's a crazy thought.
It is. We're talking about seaplane carriers operating off the coast of China.
Mm.
We were talking about freezing, chaotic, blind breakouts in the snow-choked plains of Poland.
Yeah.
We're going to look at multilingual fortresses slowly starving to death and flooded Italian rivers literally swallowing entire empires whole.
It is a necessary and frankly profound shift in perspective.
Yeah.
The standard Western Front narrative, while undeniably tragic and historically crucial, it really does a disservice to the sheer, terrifying global scale of this conflict.
It really does.
When we limit our view to just France and Belgium, we miss the truly bizarre, highly mobile, and technologically experimental fringes of the war that actually dictated how the empires fought, adapted, and ultimately collapsed.
And that is precisely our mission today. We're going to completely reframe your understanding of the First World War.
Reframe it entirely.
To do this, we've pulled together a massive stack of sources for you. Specifically, 5 incredibly detailed Wikipedia articles covering massive yet wildly different engagement.
Right, covering a lot of ground.
We're going to examine the Siege of Tsingtao, the Battle of Verdun, the Siege of Przemysl, the Battle of Arras, and the Second Battle of the Piave River.
It's a huge scope.
It is. Our goal isn't just to recount dates and casualty figures. We want to explore the true, sprawling, global scale of the war, the terrifying extremes of the environments these soldiers were forced to fight in, and the rapid, almost desperate evolution of military tactics on the ground.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this.
The goal today is to connect the dots between these 5 seemingly disparate, geographically isolated battles. We want to show you how these massive empires frantically adapted to modern warfare in real time. We are going to look at the granular details of what that human cost actually felt like on the ground. Because when you move away from just staring at the static lines of the Western Front, you see what is essentially a horrifying, globally distributed laboratory of military science and human endurance.
I love that framing.
Yeah.
A horrifying laboratory.
Okay.
So, to start this deep dive, we're going to travel to the very last place most people associate with the outbreak of World War I. We are heading to Asia. Specifically, we're looking at August 1914 in a German colonial port city called Qingdao, China. And right off the bat, I have to ask, how on earth did a massive European war immediately trigger a siege in China?
To understand that, we have to look at the aggressive imperialism of the late 19th century.
Okay.
Back in 1898, the German Empire under Kaiser Wilhelm II essentially strong-armed the Qing dynasty into granting them a 99-year lease on the area around Kyushu Bay.
Wow, 99 years.
Yeah. They poured massive amounts of money into Qingdao, or Tsingtao as it was spelled then, turning it from a relatively small fishing village into a heavily fortified, modernized naval base.
So it wasn't just a tiny outpost.
Not at all. It had wide streets, modern plumbing, breweries, and most importantly, it was the deep water home port for the German East Asia Squadron. It was Germany's crown jewel in the Pacific, their main hub for projecting naval power across the globe.
But the moment the Archduke is assassinated in Sarajevo and the dominoes fall in Europe, that prized colony suddenly becomes a massive liability, doesn't it? Because Japan enters the chat.
Precisely. And what's fascinating here is the geopolitical shift happening right beneath the surface.
Right.
You have Great Britain, who had been viewing the German naval buildup in the Pacific with immense paranoid suspicion for over a decade.
Naturally.
To counter this, Britain had actively forged closer ties with Japan, culminating in the Anglo-Japanese alliance of 1902. So when war breaks out in August 1914, Britain officially requests Japanese assistance to hunt down armed German raiders in the Pacific.
But Japan takes it a step further.
They absolutely do. Japan, seeing a golden opportunity to expand its own empire and eliminate its primary European rival in Asia, doesn't just hunt ships. They issue a blatant ultimatum to Germany. Hand over the entire port of Tsingtao immediately, without conditions.
And of course, Kaiser Wilhelm II isn't going to just hand over his prized colony. I was reading through the source material, and he actually sent a telegraph stating that it would shame him more to surrender Tsingtao to the Japanese than it would to surrender Berlin to the Russians.
It's a wild statement.
He orders them to defend it to the last man.
Which was essentially a death sentence for the garrison.
Yeah.
The German commander in Tsingtao, Captain Alfred Meyer-Waldeck, was a deeply pragmatic man. He knew he was completely isolated.
He had to know.
The main German East Asia Squadron, commanded by Vice Admiral Maximilian von Spee, had already recognized the trap. Spee took his heavy cruisers and fled across the Pacific toward South America, knowing that staying in port meant annihilation.
Smart move by Spee. So Meyer-Waldeck is left behind.
Yes. He's left with roughly 3,600 men. This wasn't even a cohesive army. It was a hodgepodge of Marines, naval personnel whose ships were undergoing repairs, Chinese colonial troops, and even a contingent of Austro-Hungarian sailors from a cruiser called the Kaiserin Elizabeth that happened to be trapped in the harbor.
So you have 3,600 isolated cut-off defenders. And marching toward them is an incredibly well-equipped Japanese force of over 23,000 men.
Vastly outnumbered.
Eventually joined by a token British force of about 1,500. But here's where it gets really interesting. This isn't just a standard 19th century colonial skirmish.
Right.
The Siege of Tsingtao is actually a battle of massive technological firsts.
Huge firsts.
I mean, we're talking about aviation, which is in its absolute infancy in 1914. Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk was barely a decade prior. And yet, we see the Japanese utilizing a ship called the Wakamiya.
Yes, the Wakamiya.
Can you explain what this ship was actually doing? Because the idea of a 1914 aircraft carrier is just blowing my mind.
It really challenges our timeline of military aviation, doesn't it? The Wakamiya wasn't an aircraft carrier in the modern sense. It didn't have a flat flight deck.
Right.
It was a seaplane tender. It carried 4 Maurice Farman seaplanes. These were incredibly fragile wire and canvas biplanes with pontoons attached to the bottom.
Wire and canvas.
Exactly. The crew of the Wakamiya would literally use a heavy derrick crane to hoist these planes over the side of the ship and lower them down into the ocean swells.
Oh, wow.
The pilots would then start the engines, taxi across the water, and take off right from the sea.
That sounds incredibly dangerous, just on a mechanical level, let alone in a combat zone.
It was incredibly risky, but the strategic advantage was unprecedented. Beginning in early September 1914, these Japanese seaplanes conducted the world's very first naval-launched air raids.
The first ever.
Yes. They flew over the fortified German harbor, scouting artillery positions and dropping explosives on the trapped German ships, including the Austro-Hungarian cruiser Kaiserin Elizabeth and the German gunboat Jaguar.
That's insane.
They even conducted the first recorded nighttime bombing raid in history.
At night. In 1914.
The psychological impact on the German defenders, having explosives dropped on them from the sky in the middle of the night, was profound. It fundamentally changed the rules of naval engagement. We are seeing a stark foreshadowing of the Pacific theater that would play out decades later in the Second World War. Japan was actively testing and proving the concept of modern carrier-style warfare.
And what's wild is that the Germans weren't completely blind in the sky either. But their situation was so much more desperate. They had exactly one operational airplane left in the entire colony.
Just one.
It was an Etrich Taube, which, if you look at pictures of it, literally looks like a giant mechanical bird with these swept-back dove-like wings.
A very striking design.
And it was flown by a single guy, Lieutenant Gunther Pluschow.
Pluschow's story is one of the most romanticized yet objectively terrifying narratives of the early war. He was entirely alone up there.
Entirely.
He was flying this fragile, unarmed monoplane over a besieging army of tens of thousands of men, constantly taking ground fire. He was acting as the sole set of eyes for the German artillery commanders, desperately trying to map out the Japanese trench networks.
And he wasn't just scouting. The sources say he was dropping improvised bombs out of the cockpit by hand, just leaning over the side of the fuselage and tossing explosives.
Yeah.
And then he supposedly claims the first aerial victory in aviation history. Not with a mounted machine gun, because they didn't have those yet, but by pulling out his personal service pistol and shooting at a Japanese Farman seaplane midair.
Incredible.
I'm struggling to picture the sheer adrenaline of two pilots taking potshots at each other with handguns thousands of feet in the air.
It highlights the improvised, almost experimental nature of this siege. Plusho became a massive annoyance to the Japanese command. But ultimately, one man in a Tau couldn't stop an empire.
Right.
As the Japanese closed in, Meyer-Waldeck, the German commander, realized the fortress was going to fall. On November 6th, literally the day before the final Japanese assault, he gave Plusho his final orders. Escape.
Get out of there.
Plusho strapped the governor's final dispatches to his body, took off in the Taube, and flew deep into Chinese territory until he ran out of fuel, eventually making his way back to Germany after an insane multi-year journey.
But back on the ground, the siege was grinding toward its inevitable conclusion. And before we move on from Tsingtao, we have to talk about the British involvement, because it perfectly illustrates the messy reality of these newly formed global alliances. Britain sent a relatively small force, the South Wales Borderers and the 36 Sikhs, but they weren't really there to help Japan win. They were there to keep an eye on them, right?
Exactly. Britain was deeply uncomfortable with the idea of Japan taking over a massive fortified deep-water port in China, essentially replacing German imperialism with Japanese imperialism right next to British spheres of influence.
Right in their backyard.
The British troops were sent as a political statement. We are here, we are watching, and we expect a say in what happens to this territory after the battle.
Which led to a massive problem on the battlefield. The source mentions a severe friendly fire issue. The Japanese sentries kept shooting at the British troops.
You have to consider the conditions. You are operating in heavy rain, in muddy trenches, often at night or in thick fog. The standard British khaki uniforms, when caked in dark mud and seen from a distance, didn't look drastically different from the German uniforms to a Japanese sentry who had never fought alongside British troops before.
That makes sense.
The friction of this newly formed coalition was resulting in lethal mistakes.
And the solution they came up with is so absurdly pragmatic. The British command literally had to issue Japanese military raincoats to the British soldiers.
Yes.
They told the South Wales Borderers to wear these specific Japanese raincoats over their own uniforms so that their allies would recognize the silhouette and stop shooting at them. It's such a tiny, bizarre detail, but it speaks volumes about how messy this war was from day one.
It truly does. And the ultimate outcome at Tsingtao, which fell on November 7th after a methodical, overwhelming Japanese artillery bombardment, proved a crucial military doctrine. Japan's use of parallel siege trenches and massive 11-inch howitzers.
Tactics they knew well.
Tactics they had perfected just 9 years earlier during the Russo-Japanese War at Port Arthur. It proved that modern, heavy artillery could systematically reduce and destroy any static fortress, no matter how well built. The era of the impenetrable walled city was officially over.
So Tsingtao proves that if you sit still in a fortress, modern artillery will eventually crush you. But what happens when armies refuse to sit still? What happens when millions of men are moving rapidly trying to outflank each other?
A very different kind of war.
Because just a few weeks later, and thousands of miles away in Europe, the Germans and the Russians were testing a completely different, infinitely more chaotic type of war.
This is where the concept of the laboratory really becomes terrifying. We are moving from the calculated, methodical siege warfare of the coast of China to the sheer, freezing chaos of maneuver warfare on the Eastern Front.
Which brings us to the Battle of Verdun, taking place in November and December of 1914. To set the scene for you, we are in the freezing plains of Poland. The Russian Empire is feeling confident. They are amassing a massive army, preparing for a devastating invasion of Silesia.
A huge threat.
Now, Silesia is the industrial heartland of the German Empire. If the Russians get into Silesia, the German war machine loses its coal, its steel, its factories. The war could literally be over in months.
Germany couldn't let that happen.
To prevent this, the German High Command, specifically Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, have to pull off a logistical miracle. They decide to preemptively strike. They pull their entire 9th Army out of southern Poland and shift it hundreds of miles north. And they do this by running 80 trains a day.
80 trains.
I have to pause here. How do you coordinate 80 massive steam trains a day on 1914 rail infrastructure without modern computers or radios?
The logistics of the German railway system in 1914 cannot be overstated. It was the secret weapon of the German General Staff.
The secret weapon.
They had a dedicated railway department within the military that spent decades prior to the war meticulously planning train schedules down to the minute. Every station, every sighting, every water tower was mapped out.
Just mathematical precision.
When Hindenburg and Ludendorff ordered the Ninth Army north, they were executing pre-calculated timetables. They moved an entire army, hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of horses, field artillery, and ammunition laterally across their own front lines in a matter of days. The goal was to achieve absolute operational surprise.
And the plan was to smash into the right flank of the Russian Second Army, right near the city of Udu. The sources describe this as an attempt at a double envelopment. I know that's a classic military term, but I'm struggling to picture exactly how that looks on the ground. Can you break down what a double envelopment actually means for the soldiers involved?
Think of it like a giant pair of pincers, or a crab's claws. A single envelopment is flanking your enemy, moving around one side of their line to attack them from the side and the front simultaneously.
Okay, got it.
A double envelopment is the holy grail of maneuver warfare. You smash through the enemy lines on both the extreme left and the extreme right simultaneously. Your two attacking wings then hook inward behind the enemy army, linking up in their rear.
So you surround them.
If you successfully close the pincers, you have completely surrounded the enemy army. They have no supply lines, no way to retreat, and they are taking fire from 360 degrees. This is exactly what the Germans had done to a different Russian army at the Battle of Tannenberg just a few months prior, destroying it completely. They were trying to recreate that masterpiece at Udu.
And initially, the surprise works perfectly. The German Ninth Army smashes into the gap between the Russian corps. The pincers start to close. But the Russian High Command, specifically Grand Duke Nicholas, isn't totally incompetent. He realizes the severity of the danger.
He saw it coming.
He immediately cancels the invasion of Silesia and orders the Russian Fifth Army, commanded by General Pavel Plev, to abandon their positions and march north to save the Second Army. And they move with insane speed, covering 72 miles in just 2 days on foot.
Which is an agonizing forced march, especially when you factor in the environment. We have to discuss the weather, because the weather at Udu wasn't just a backdrop. It was an active, lethal participant in the battle.
The temperatures were plummeting to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, which is minus 12 Celsius. And it wasn't just cold. It was freezing, dense fog.
Imagine the sensory deprivation. You have hundreds of thousands of men marching through unfamiliar Polish countryside. The roads are turning into frozen ruts of mud. The fog is so thick you can't see 50 feet in front of you.
You can't see anything.
And remember, in 1914, armies relied on visual signals, flags, flares, and dispatch riders on horseback. The fog effectively blinds the commanders of both armies. It severs the nervous system of the military structure.
And because of this fog, and because the Russian Fifth Army arrived so incredibly fast after that forced march, the entire battle geometry violently flips in a matter of hours.
It's a total reversal.
The German pincers that were trying to surround the Russian Second Army suddenly find themselves slamming into the Russian Fifth Army. The Germans who had broken through into the Russian rear are now cut off from their own lines. The hunters have become the hunted. It turns from a double envelopment into a massive, chaotic cauldron battle.
The focal point of this chaos falls on the German 25th Reserve Corps. This unit was commanded by General Reinhard von Schäfer-Boyadel.
Schäfer-Boyadel.
Now, Schäfer-Boyadel was a 63-year-old general who had been recalled from retirement. He was an old-school Prussian officer, and suddenly he finds his entire corps, tens of thousands of men, completely surrounded southeast of Udu by an overwhelming Russian force.
The Russians are ecstatic. They are so absolutely certain that they have trapped and destroyed this German corps that the Russian command literally orders trains to be brought up to the front lines to accommodate up to 20,000 anticipated German prisoners of war. They are celebrating before the battle's even over.
But they fundamentally miscalculated two things: the sheer disciplined desperation of the trapped German troops and the catastrophic fragility of their own Russian command structure under pressure.
Right.
Schäfer-Boyadel evaluates the situation. He has no supplies, the temperature is lethal, and he is surrounded. He decides that surrender is not an option. He orders his corps to turn around, face the Russian lines that trapped them, and break out by force.
This leads to what has to be one of the most terrifying cinematic moments of the entire war. The vanguard, the tip of the spear leading this breakout attempt, is a cavalry unit commanded by a man named Manfred von Richthofen.
Yes, the uncle.
Who, for the aviation buffs out there, is the great-uncle of the famous Red Baron. They are tasked with punching a hole through the Russian lines at night. And because the fog is so thick and the Russian lines are so close, Richthofen issues an incredible order. He tells his men to fix bayonets, and then he orders them to completely unload the ammunition from their rifles.
It's a brilliant, if terrifying, tactical decision. In the pitch black and freezing fog, a single accidental gunshot from a nervous, freezing soldier would instantly give away their position and bring down the entire weight of Russian artillery on their heads. By unloading the rifles, Richthofen ensured absolute silence. It forced his men to rely entirely on cold steel.
So you have thousands of freezing German soldiers, armed only with bayonets, sneaking through the icy night. And they literally stumble right into the town of Brzezinny, which is currently occupied by the sleeping Russian 6th Siberian Division.
The historical accounts of this breakout are surreal. Because of the absolute silence and the sheer audacity of the move, the German troops actually managed to occupy large sections of the town of Brzezinny before a single shot was fired. It's unbelievable.
The Russian sentries were either frozen, asleep, or completely caught off guard.
But wait, how does a sleeping division of Siberians not wake up and immediately annihilate the Germans once the alarm is finally raised? Where was the Russian command?
The Russian command was experiencing a total cascading structural collapse. General Nikolai Russky, who was overseeing the sector, completely lost his nerve.
Just broke down.
The short winter days, the blinding fog, and the conflicting reports coming in from his terrified frontline commanders broke him. He was literally issuing orders via telegraph and then immediately sending a second telegraph contradicting the first one. The local Russian commanders in Brzezinny were completely paralyzed, unsure of whether to attack, retreat, or hold their ground.
And because of this absolute paralysis at the top, Schäfer-Boydell pulls off the impossible. His 63-year-old retired general manages to march his entire trapped corps right through the Russian lines. And he doesn't just escape.
No. The sources say he brought his wounded with him. He dragged out 12,000 Russian prisoners that he had captured while he was surrounded, and he even hauled away 64 captured Russian artillery pieces. It is the great escape of World War I.
It is a stunning tactical achievement, but it leaves us with a fascinating, almost contradictory strategic outcome. Historians often debate who actually won the Battle of Verdun.
How is it a debate? The Germans escaped a trap and took prisoners. Doesn't that make it a German victory?
Tactically, you could argue it was a Russian victory. The Russian army successfully recognized the double envelopment trap, rushed reinforcements to the sector, broke the German encirclement, saved their second army from being destroyed, and avoided suffering another Tannenberg-level disaster. The German Ninth Army failed to destroy the Russians.
Oh, I see. But the original Russian plan.
Exactly. Strategically, it was a massive, decisive victory for the German Empire. Why? Because the original Russian objective, that massive invasion of the German industrial heartland of Silesia, was permanently derailed.
They stopped the invasion.
The sheer chaos and heavy casualties of the battle forced the Russians to abandon the offensive and fall back to more defensible lines closer to Warsaw. The Russian army never threatened deep German soil so closely for the rest of the entire war. The German preemptive strike achieved its ultimate strategic goal, even if the tactical execution devolved into freezing chaos.
It's deeply unsettling when you try to visualize the reality of maneuver warfare on the Eastern Front. No static trenches to hide in. Just millions of men stumbling into each other in freezing fog, where the lines between attacker and defender dissolve instantly.
It's a nightmare.
But as 1914 bleeds into 1915, this rapid maneuver warfare begins to grind to a halt in certain sectors. And the consequences of that halt were arguably even more horrific than the chaos of Verdun. We are moving from the agility of armies moving 80 trains a day to the agonizing slow deaths of absolute stagnation. We are going to look at the siege of
Przemyśl represents a completely different nightmare. It was a massive Austro-Hungarian fortress complex located along the San River in what is now southeastern Poland. Unlike the fast-moving armies at Verdun, this was a stationary target.
They weren't going anywhere.
And when the Russian armies advanced through the region in the fall of 1914, they didn't want to get bogged down in a costly urban assault. So they simply bypassed the fortress, encircled it with a ring of troops, cut off all supply lines, and settled in to starve the defenders out. This siege lasted for a staggering 133 days. It was the longest siege in Europe during the entire First World War.
To truly understand the horror of Przemyśl, you have to understand who was locked inside. Because it wasn't just a military base. Inside this ring of Russian steel, you had a sprawling garrison of 127,000 Austro-Hungarian soldiers.
That's a massive force.
But you also had 18,000 civilians trapped with them. And this garrison was a perfect tragic microcosm of the Austro-Hungarian Empire itself. The sources explicitly note that because the empire was such a massive, disjointed patchwork of different nationalities and ethnicities, the daily military orders within the fortress had to be issued in 15 different languages.
15 languages. Just pause and think about the sheer friction that introduces to a chain of command. How does an Austrian general efficiently convey a complex defensive order down to a Hungarian colonel who passes it to a Polish captain who has to give it to a squad of Ukrainian or Romanian peasant conscripts?
It's a recipe for disaster.
The potential for mistranslation, confusion, and deep-seated suspicion was woven into the very fabric of their army.
And as the siege dragged on from the autumn of 1914 to the bitter winter and into the spring of 1915, that friction ignited. Whatever initial patriotic fervor existed at the start of the war completely evaporated. As the food supplies dwindled, the multi-ethnic society inside the fortress began to aggressively devour itself.
They turned on each other.
We aren't just guessing about this either. We have primary sources. The sources point out that surviving diaries from people trapped inside paint a devastating picture of civil and moral collapse.
The diary of Dr. Joseph Thoman is particularly harrowing. He was an Austrian junior doctor, a medical officer serving in the fortress hospitals. His entries are not the stoic, heroic accounts you expect from wartime propaganda. They are dripping with absolute disgust, primarily aimed at his own superior officers.
The sources say he writes about the hospital system, which was completely overwhelmed. They were dealing with typhus, cholera, and rampant malnutrition. To cope, the military administration began recruiting local teenage girls from the civilian population to work as nurses. The military offered them 120 crowns a month and, crucially, free meals.
Free food during a starvation siege.
In a starving city, that is an offer you cannot refuse. But the sources note Thoman explicitly, furiously writes in his diary that these young girls were essentially being drafted into institutionalized exploitation. He writes that they were primarily there to be used by the officers.
The medical realities he recorded reflect the moral decay. Thoman documents the explosive spread of venereal diseases, syphilis and gonorrhea, running rampant through the officer corps and the newly recruited nursing staff. He refers to his own superiors as pestilent pigs in their spotless uniforms.
Pestilent pigs.
He was furiously noting that while the enlisted men and the civilians were literally starving in the streets, the officers were hoarding what little high-quality food remained and exploiting desperate young women. It is a complete breakdown of military discipline and basic human decency.
And that class and moral divide is echoed in another incredible source provided here, the diary of Helena Jablonska. She was a wealthy, middle-aged Polish woman living inside the city. Her diary gives us a window into the civilian nightmare. And the sources point out it exposes the visceral, ugly anti-Semitism that rapidly boiled to the surface as the society collapsed.
Yes, the source material explicitly documents how she blamed others. Jablonska's diary is difficult to read, but historically vital. As the caloric intake of the city plummeted, the black market thrived. Jablonska, writing from a position of relative privilege, complains bitterly and constantly about Jewish merchants in the city. She outright accuses them of hoarding supplies and malicious price gouging. She essentially scapegoats the Jewish population for the structural failure of the Austro-Hungarian military logistics.
And that simmering hatred has a brutal, horrific climax in the texts. In March 1915, the garrison is finally broken. They have eaten all the cavalry horses. They have eaten the stray dogs and cats.
Everything was gone.
The commander, General Hermann Kuzmanek, orders the destruction of the fortress's own artillery so the Russians can't use it. And on March 22nd, he officially surrenders the city. Over 117,000 starving Austro-Hungarian soldiers march out into captivity.
But the tragedy doesn't end with the surrender. When the Russian Imperial Army, specifically the Tsarist Cossack cavalry units, enter the fallen city, they bring their own virulent anti-Semitism with them. They find a city already fractured by ethnic hatred, and they ignite it.
The texts note Jablonska's diary captures this exactly. The Cossacks unleash a violent systemic pogrom against the Jewish population of Przemysl. She coldly notes how the Cossacks deliberately waited until the Jewish residents gathered at the synagogue for prayers and then set upon them with whips and sabers, beating them in the streets.
It's awful.
The fact that she writes about this with an almost detached, grim satisfaction just underlines how deeply the societal rot had set in. The fortress didn't just fall to Russian artillery. It collapsed internally under the weight of starvation and ethnic hatred.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the physical isolation of those 133 days was absolute. The only way the garrison communicated with the outside world was by sending up unmanned paper balloons, hoping the wind would carry them over the Russian siege lines, or by releasing carrier pigeons. But the true horror of Przemyśl isn't just what happened inside the walls, it is what happened in the mountains outside.
You're talking about the relief efforts.
Yes. The chief of the Austro-Hungarian General Staff was a man named Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf. Conrad became strategically and psychologically obsessed with breaking the siege. He viewed the potential fall of Przemyśl as a fatal blow to the prestige of the Habsburg monarchy.
He couldn't let it go.
So, throughout the brutal winter of 1914 and early 1915, he ordered offensive after offensive. He hurled hundreds of thousands of Austro-Hungarian soldiers against the Russian lines in the frozen, treacherous terrain of the Carpathian Mountains, desperately trying to punch a hole through to the fortress.
And I need our listeners to brace themselves for this next number, because when I read it in the source material, I had to stop and reread it to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. The cost of Conrad's obsessive rescue attempts. The Austro-Hungarian army suffered 800,000 casualties in the Carpathian Winter Offensive. 800,000 men.
It is a casualty figure that defies human comprehension. Nearly 1 million men wiped off the board in a matter of months. And the most tragic aspect of this is that the vast majority of those 800,000 casualties were not killed by Russian bullets or artillery.
They weren't.
No, they were killed by the environment. Conrad ordered men to assault fortified mountain passes in the dead of winter, without adequate winter clothing, without proper supply lines, and without sufficient shelter. They died of severe frostbite, exposure, typhus, and exhaustion. Entire battalions simply froze to death in the snowdrifts.
It is a staggering monument to military incompetence. To lose 800,000 men trying to save a fortress of 120,000 men, it just breaks the brain.
Historians frequently refer to the siege of Przemyśl as Austria-Hungary's Stalingrad. The loss of the garrison itself was a severe blow, but the loss of those 800,000 men in the relief efforts fundamentally broke the back of the Austro-Hungarian Imperial Army.
It broke them completely.
From the spring of 1915 onward, the Habsburg Empire ceased to function as a truly independent military power. Their army was so gutted by the Carpathians that they had to rely entirely on the German Empire to supply them, reinforce them, and essentially command them for the remainder of the war. Przemyśl was the wound that slowly bled the empire to death.
It's an overwhelming amount of human suffering caused by sheer logistical and command failure. And as the years dragged on, as 1915 turned into 1916, with the bloody stalemates of Verdun and the Somme, the armies of Europe realized that neither freezing maneuver warfare nor starving sieges were winning the war. They needed a strategic breakthrough.
They needed something completely new.
And on the Western Front, they decided that the only way to break the deadlock of the trenches was to fundamentally engineer a new way of fighting. Which brings us to the spring of 1917 and the Battle of Arras.
By early 1917, the strategic situation for the Allies on the Western Front was bleak. The French army was exhausted and on the verge of mutiny. The plan for 1917 was for the French commander, Robert Nivelle, to launch a massive war-winning offensive to the south. But to ensure the French had a chance, the British Expeditionary Force needed to launch a massive diversionary attack further north, at the city of Arras.
So it was a distraction, essentially.
The goal was to draw the German reserves away from the French sector, and if possible, punch a hole straight through the German trench network. But to do that, the British couldn't just rely on walking slowly across no man's land. They needed to innovate.
And the scale of that innovation is breathtaking. When we think of trenches, we think of ditches dug 6 feet into the mud. But at Arras, the British didn't just dig trenches. They built an entire underground subterranean city.
A literal city underground.
The city of Arras is built on a foundation of chalk. For centuries, going back to the Roman era, people had quarried this chalk, leaving a vast network of ancient, disconnected caves beneath the city. The British military realized the potential of this. They brought in specialized mining units, primarily the New Zealand Tunneling Company.
Men who knew what they were doing.
Men who had spent their civilian lives digging gold and coal mines in New Zealand, and tasked them with secretly connecting these ancient caves into a massive, continuous underground staging ground.
The engineering logistics are phenomenal. The New Zealanders working alongside British and working-class bantams.
Bantams.
Yes, soldiers who were traditionally too short to meet the height requirements of the regular army but were perfect for tunnel work. They dug over 12 miles of subways. They carved out an underground labyrinth capable of hiding 24,500 Allied troops.
And it wasn't just a dark, damp cave. They fully modernized it. They ran electrical cables to provide lighting. They piped in fresh running water. They built fully functioning underground hospitals with operating theaters. They even laid down miniature railway tracks so they could use hand-drawn tramways to quietly move thousands of tons of ammunition and high explosives right up to the front lines without ever being exposed to the surface.
It's brilliant.
It was a secret city, designed to protect the assault force from the devastating German artillery bombardments that usually decimated troops massing in surface trenches before an attack.
It provided a massive tactical advantage. The German military also had mining units, but they were completely outmatched in the Arras sector by the Allied tunnelers. The element of surprise on the ground was secured. However, to make the ground assault work, the British needed absolute superiority in the air.
Which was a problem.
They needed airplanes to fly over the German lines, map out the artillery positions using aerial photography, and spot targets for the British guns. But the airspace over Arras in April 1917 was arguably the most lethal environment in the world.
Yes, the infamous Bloody April. This is where the grim reality of rapid technological advancement rears its head. The Royal Flying Corps was tasked with this vital reconnaissance. But they were flying aircraft that were technologically obsolete compared to what the Germans were putting in the sky. The British were flying planes like the BE-2, which was a staple, slow, two-seater reconnaissance plane. It was great for taking photographs, but it was basically a sitting duck in a dogfight.
And waiting for them was the German Luststreitkräfte, specifically the elite hunting squadrons like Josta 11, commanded by a man who needs almost no introduction, Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron.
The Red Baron himself.
We mentioned his cavalry uncle earlier, but Manfred had transferred to the air service. And he, along with his pilots, were flying the new Albatros D-3 fighters. These planes had twin synchronized machine guns that fired directly through the propeller arc. They were faster, heavier armed, and more maneuverable.
It was an absolute slaughter. The German fighters decimated the Royal Flying Corps. The British commanders knew their planes were inferior, but the strategic need for aerial photography to support the infantry attack was so critical that they simply ordered the pilots to keep flying, accepting the horrific losses. The statistics from Bloody April are chilling.
They really are.
The average life expectancy of a new British pilot arriving in the Arras sector in April 1917 was just 18 hours of flight time. 18 hours.
It's hard to fathom.
They were taking teenagers fresh out of flight school in England with barely a dozen hours of solo flying, and throwing them straight into a meat grinder against seasoned German aces.
It's heartbreaking. But despite the total loss of air superiority, the British commanders pushed forward with the ground assault. And the artillery plan they devised was revolutionary. Because they had realized that simply bombing the enemy trenches for a week straight didn't work. It just churned the ground into impassable mud and gave the enemy plenty of warning to bring up reserves.
So they changed tactics.
Instead, at Arras, they perfected the creeping barrage.
Can you explain how this creeping barrage actually works? Because the timing required seems impossibly dangerous to me.
The creeping barrage is a masterpiece of lethal choreography. Instead of just firing at the enemy trenches, the artillery fires continuous curtain of high explosives and shrapnel into no man's land, landing roughly 100 meters in front of their own advancing infantry.
Okay.
Every minute or so, the artillery gunners meticulously adjust their elevation, lifting the barrage and moving it forward another 50 meters. The infantry is trained to walk literally right behind this wall of exploding shells.
So you have thousands of men walking slowly across a muddy field, while their own artillery is dropping high explosives a football field away from their faces. If an artillery crew mathematically miscalculates the wind or the powder charge by a fraction of an inch, they are dropping shells directly onto the heads of their own men.
Exactly. It required immense discipline from the infantry to stay close to the barrage, and immense mathematical precision from the gunners. The goal of the creeping barrage wasn't necessarily to kill the Germans in their deep dugouts, it was to force them to keep their heads down. The barrage rolls over the trench, and before the German defenders can climb up the stairs from their deep bunkers to man their machine guns, the British infantry is already standing on the lip of the trench looking down at them.
But a barrage is only effective if it can clear the obstacles in front of the trench, specifically the dense belts of barbed wire. And this is where another massive technological leap comes in. In previous battles, like the Somme, the British artillery had fired millions of shells, but the shells had delayed action fuses, So they would plunge deep into the soft, churned-up mud before exploding.
Which just threw geysers of dirt into the air. It didn't destroy the barbed wire sitting on the surface, it just tangled it worse. The infantry would advance expecting a clear path and find impenetrable walls of wire waiting for them, and they would be massacred by machine gun fire.
To solve this at Arras, the British mass-produced a terrifyingly simple innovation, the known 10A6 fuse.
The 10.
Instead of a delayed timer, the number 106 had a highly sensitive striker plate projecting from the nose of the shell. It was designed to detonate instantaneously upon the absolute slightest impact. If it hit the ground, it exploded. If it brushed against a strand of barbed wire, it exploded above ground. This created a horizontal blast of shrapnel that literally vaporized the German wire entanglements, leaving clear paths for the infantry.
The combination of the subterranean surprise, the creeping barrage, and the number 106 fuse created a perfect storm for the opening day of the battle. 0 hour was set for 5:30 a.m. on April 9, 1917. And once again, as we saw at Odu, weather plays a critical, chaotic role.
The weather again.
It was freezing cold, and a heavy squall of sleet and snow was blowing from the west. This meant the wind was blowing the snow directly into the faces of the German defenders, blinding them while pushing at the backs of the advancing British and Canadian troops.
The initial assault is a spectacular shock. The tens of thousands of troops hiding in the subterranean caves burst out onto the surface. The creeping barrage rolls forward, vaporizing the wire. The blinded German troops are completely caught off guard. The historical accounts of that morning are incredible.
They really are.
Because the bombardment was so sudden and effective, British troops captured hundreds of German soldiers who were still half-dressed, scrambling up the stairs of their deep dugouts. Some Germans were captured without their boots, stuck knee-deep in the freezing mud trying to run away in their socks. It was a massive initial triumph. The Canadian Corps famously executed a brilliantly coordinated assault on the northern flank, capturing the heavily fortified heights of Avigny Ridge in a single day, an achievement that is still celebrated as a defining moment of Canadian national identity.
The success on the first day wasn't just due to shock and awe. The British infantry themselves had evolved. They weren't fighting the same way they fought at the Somme a year earlier. The British High Command had analyzed their failures and issued a new revolutionary training manual known as SS-143.
Which fundamentally changed the structure of the infantry platoon. Can you break down why SS-143 was such a big deal?
Before 1917, the standard British infantry tactic was to advance in rigid, long lines of riflemen. The idea was to overwhelm the enemy with a continuous wave of bayonets and rifle fire. But a single machine gun can mow down a rigid line in seconds. SS-143 abolished the rigid line. It decentralized command down to the platoon level, giving junior officers and sergeants the autonomy to make tactical decisions on the fly.
That's a huge shift in doctrine.
More importantly, it changed the composition of the platoon. A platoon was no longer just 30 guys with rifles. It was divided into 4 specialized, interdependent sections. You had a section equipped with a Lewis gun, a portable, drum-fed light machine gun that 1 or 2 men could carry. You had a section of rifle grenadiers who could launch explosives in a high arc. You had a section of hand bombers trained to clear trenches with hand grenades. And finally, a section of traditional riflemen.
So how does that specialization change a firefight? Let's say this new platoon encounters a surviving German machine gun nest in a ruined farmhouse. What do they do?
In 1915, they would have been ordered to charge it and probably died. In 1917, under SS-143, they execute fire and maneuver. The Lewis gun section drops down and lays down a heavy base of suppressing fire, forcing the German gunners to keep their heads down. While the enemy is pinned, the rifle grenadiers launch explosives over the walls. Meanwhile, the hand bombers and riflemen use the terrain to infiltrate around the flanks, creeping up on the blind sides of the bunker.
It's a coordinated team.
Once they are close enough, they throw hand grenades through the firing slits and clear the position. It is small unit combined arms tactics. The manual taught them to leapfrog past resistance, flowing around strong points like water to keep the momentum of the attack going.
So the British have completely overhauled their approach. They have underground logistics, instantaneous fuses, creeping barrages, and specialized autonomous platoons. It sounds like they have finally solved the riddle of trench warfare. But the Germans aren't just sitting there passively taking the punches, they are actively studying the war too. And during Arras, the German High Command is undergoing a massive, violent doctrinal crisis of their own on how to defend against these new tactics, right?
Exactly. The German military was deeply divided in early 1917. The commander of the German Sixth Army defending Arras was General Ludwig von Falkenhausen. He was a traditionalist. He firmly believed in a rigid, unyielding frontline defense. His philosophy was that every single inch of German-held territory was sacred and must be defended to the death.
Hold at all costs.
He packed his infantry densely into the forward trench lines, telling them to hold at all costs. Crucially, he kept his reinforcement divisions, his reserves, up to 15 miles behind the front lines, so they wouldn't get hit by artillery.
Which, against the new British tactics, proved to be catastrophically obsolete.
Precisely. Because Falkenhausen packed his men into the front lines, the British creeping barrage and the number 106 fuses simply vaporized them. And because his reserves were 15 miles away, by the time they received orders to march forward, the British had already broken through, captured the trenches, and set up their own machine guns. The reserves arrived exhausted, marching through mud and artillery fire, only to be cut down.
But there was an alternative theory of defense circulating in the German High Command, championed by a very influential staff officer named Colonel Fritz von Lossberg. Lossberg saw what happened on the first days of Arras, and he forcefully argued that Falkenhausen's rigid front line was suicide.
He had a completely different vision.
I want to dig into Lossberg's theory because it seems completely counterintuitive to military tradition. He championed a concept called defense in depth. Can you explain this to me? Because the core idea of defense in depth is that you voluntarily give up ground to the enemy, right? Wouldn't telling your army, hey, we're just going to let them capture our front line, completely destroy the morale of soldiers who had bled for years to hold that mud?
It was highly controversial, and it required immense psychological discipline from the troops. Lossberg argued that trying to hold a thin, rigid line against modern massed artillery was impossible. It was like trying to stop a tidal wave with a brick wall. The wall will shatter. Instead, Lossberg proposed building a defense that acted like a sponge.
A sponge.
He abolished the idea of a single, heavily manned front line. Instead, he organized the defense into deep zones. The very front, facing no man's land, was designated the outpost zone. It was very lightly held, just a few scattered machine gun nests and snipers hiding in shell craters. Their job wasn't to stop the British attack. Their job was simply to break up the cohesion of the British platoons, inflict some casualties, and slow them down.
So they're basically speed bumps.
Exactly. Behind the outpost zones, sometimes a mile or two back, was the main battle zone. This is where the real defense was. And crucially, Lossberg placed the main battle zone on the reverse slopes of hills.
Reverse slopes.
This meant that British artillery observers, looking from their own lines, couldn't see the German bunkers. They couldn't accurately target them. The genius of defense in depth relies on exhaustion and friction. You let the British attack. They easily overrun the lightly held outpost zone. They cheer, thinking they have broken the line. But as they advance, they move out of range of their own supporting artillery. They are dragging heavy Lewis guns through miles of churned-up mud. They are exhausted, their command structure is confused, and they are disorganized.
And right when the British are at their absolute most vulnerable, exhausted, disorganized, and without artillery cover, they crest the hill and slam into the untouched German main battle zone.
Yes. And that is exactly when Lossberg unleashed the final lethal component of his system, the Eingriff divisions. These were fresh, highly trained, fully equipped counterattack divisions. Unlike Falkenhausen, who kept his reserves 15 miles away, Lossberg kept his Eingriff divisions hidden just behind the main battle zone, ready to spring.
Waiting in the wings.
The moment the exhausted British attack bogged down, the Eingriff divisions would surge forward in a massive, coordinated counterattack, hitting the disorganized British and violently pushing them all the way back to their starting lines.
It's an incredibly brutal, mathematical approach to warfare. You are trading space for time and absorbing the enemy's energy until they collapse. And we see this play out in real time at Arras. Because Falkenhausen kept his reserves too far away on April 9th, the British made those spectacular historic gains on the first 2 days. They took Vimy Ridge, they advanced miles deep into the German lines.
But then Lossberg arrives.
Right. When the German Supreme Command, Ludendorff, realized the disaster that was unfolding, he fired Falkenhausen's chief of staff. He immediately dispatched Colonel von Lossberg to the Arras sector with emergency dictatorial powers over the defense. Lossberg arrived, immediately implemented defense in depth, brought the Eingriff divisions forward, and the British advance simply slammed into a brick wall.
The battle raged on for over a month, grinding into mid-May, but the initial spectacular momentum of those first 2 days was completely lost.
So what does this all mean? The British implemented a subterranean city, perfect artillery fuses, and decentralized platoon tactics. They achieved the longest continuous advance on the Western Front since the trench lines were dug in 1914. They captured Vimy Ridge. But did they win?
That's the tragic question.
The agonizing reality is that they couldn't achieve a strategic breakthrough. Louisbourg's defense in depth proved that no matter how perfectly you engineered the initial assault, no matter how brilliantly your tunnelers worked or your gunners aimed, a disciplined enemy could absorb the punch, stretch your supply lines, and hit back with fresh reserves.
It was a tactical stalemate.
The final human cost of this technological duel is sickening. The British suffered nearly 158,000 casualties in just over a month. The Germans lost roughly 120,000 to 130,000 men. Nearly 300,000 human beings killed, maimed, or missing, all to move the line on a map a few miles east across a landscape of poisoned, churned-up mud. The Battle of Arras proved that even with maximum technological innovation, the tactical stalemate of the Western Front was almost unbreakable.
It is a profoundly tragic testament to the overwhelming supremacy of the defensive in 1917. The technology to kill had far outpaced the technology to move. However, the tactical lessons learned at Arras, the decentralized small-unit platoon tactics of SS-143, and the elastic absorbing sponge of Louisbourg's defense in depth would define how armies fought for the rest of the war.
Yeah, so it set the standard.
In fact, we see those exact concepts perfectly mirrored and ironically flipped in our final battle. We're going to see what happens when the very tactics the Germans perfected at Arras are used against their own allies to destroy an empire.
Which brings us to Section 5, or rather our final theater of the war. We are moving away from the mud of France and heading south. We are traveling to June 1918 to the Italian front, specifically the Second Battle of the Piave River. In Italy, this is famously known as the Battaglia del Solstizio, the Battle of the Solstice, and it represents the final, desperate, gasping offensive of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
The very end for them.
To give you the crucial context of why this battle is so important, we have to look back a few months to late 1917. The Italian army had suffered an absolutely catastrophic, apocalyptic defeat at the Battle of Caporetto. A combined German and Austro-Hungarian offensive had shattered the Italian lines.
Caporetto wasn't just a defeat. It was a total collapse of morale and structure. The Italian army literally routed, fleeing in a disorganized panic. They lost hundreds of thousands of men, mostly as prisoners, and abandoned vast stockpiles of artillery and supplies. They retreated for miles and miles, finally stopping only when they reached the natural geographic barrier of the Piave River.
The river was their last hope.
The Piave became the absolute last line of defense protecting the heart of Italy. If the Austro-Hungarians crossed the Piave, they marched directly into Venice, Padua, and Verona. Italy would be knocked out of the war entirely.
And the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, desperately need Italy out of the war. By June 1918, Germany is launching its massive spring offensives on the Western Front, trying to win the war before the millions of fresh American troops can arrive in force. The German High Command demands that their Austro-Hungarian allies launch a massive attack across the Piave to pin down the Italians and ideally force a surrender, freeing up troops to move to France. Emperor Karl of Austria-Hungary agrees. But behind the scenes, the Austro-Hungarian military leadership is tearing itself apart, aren't they?
The dysfunction in the Austro-Hungarian High Command was paralyzing. You have an empire fighting for its very survival, and its top generals are engaged in bitter, petty rivalries. The chief of the general staff, Arthur Arts von Strausenberg, wanted a coordinated plan, but he was dealing with Field Marshal Svetozar Borovich, who commanded the southern sector near the coast, and our old acquaintance from the frozen disaster at Brezimia, Field Marshal Konrad von Hötzendorf.
Konrad again?
Yes, Konrad, who commanded the northern mountain sector. Borovich wanted to concentrate all their forces for a single, massive punch across the lower river. Konrad, still driven by ego, vehemently demanded that the main attack be launched from his sector in the mountains, aiming for the Asiago Plateau. Because the High Command lacked the authority to impose a single vision, they compromised in the absolute worst, most mathematically foolish way possible.
They split the difference.
They split the army. Instead of massing their forces for a decisive breakthrough, they diluted their strength, spreading their infantry and artillery thinly along the entire length of the riverfront, ordering a massive, rigid, simultaneous frontal assault everywhere at once. It violated every fundamental rule of concentration of force.
And waiting for them on the opposite bank of the river is a completely revitalized Italian army. After the disaster of Caporetto, the Italian government fired their old, brutal commander, Luigi Cadorna, and replaced him with a much more pragmatic, intelligent general named Armando Diaz. Diaz spent the winter completely overhauling the Italian military. He improved rations, he instituted better leave policies to repair morale, but most importantly, He revolutionized Italian tactics. And guess whose textbook he read?
He studied the Germans. Diaz implemented a brilliant variation of the exact defense-in-depth tactics that Colonel von Lossberg had perfected against the British at Arras.
It is an incredible historical irony. Diaz looks at the Piave River and abolishes the old Italian doctrine of packing all his men into a rigid trench line on the riverbank. He knows that if the Austrians bombard a rigid line, his men will die. Instead, he implements the sponge. He leaves the riverbank lightly defended by outpost troops. He constructs his main battle zones further back, out of range of the initial Austrian artillery. He gives his smaller units, his platoons and companies, the autonomy to fight flexibly, to fall back if necessary, and to counterattack locally without waiting for orders from headquarters.
And crucially, Diaz understood the vital necessity of the Eingriff divisions. He didn't just spread his men out, he organized a massive, highly mobile central strategic reserve. He held back 13 fully equipped divisions, and he centralized a fleet of 6,000 motor trucks.
6,000 trucks.
This meant that the moment the Austro-Hungarians managed to cross the river and bog down in the Italian defense in depth, Diaz could physically rush tens of thousands of fresh troops in trucks directly to the exact point of the breakthrough to smash the exhausted attackers.
So you have the Austro-Hungarians repeating the arrogant, rigid, wide-front mistakes of 1915, marching blindly into a modern, flexible, elastic trap designed in 1918.
It was a disaster waiting to happen.
The battle begins on June 15th. The Austro-Hungarian artillery opens up, firing gas and high explosives. And despite the sheer logistical incompetence of their commanders, the individual Austro-Hungarian soldiers fight with desperate bravery. They actually managed to force crossings across the Piave River in several locations. They throw down pontoon bridges, paddle across in boats, and carve out a bridgehead on the Italian side. For a brief, terrifying moment, it looks like the Italian line might crack.
But Diaz's defense in depth works exactly as designed. The Austro-Hungarians push past the riverbank, but they immediately lose momentum as they hit the Italian main battle zones. The fighting is incredibly fierce, devolving into brutal hand-to-hand combat in the vineyards and ruined farmhouses along the river. But because the Austro-Hungarians spread their artillery too thin, they can't effectively support their infantry. They become bogged down, exhausted, and disorganized.
And right at the critical moment, when the Austro-Hungarians are trapped on the western bank, desperately trying to push forward, nature steps in to deliver the final lethal blow.
The environment acts again.
We talked about the freezing fog at Verdun and the snow squalls at Arras. The weather at the Piave River was arguably the most decisive environmental intervention of the war. Massive rainstorms hit the Alps to the north. This heavy rainfall, combined with late spring snowmelt, surges down the mountains and violently swells the Piave River.
The river essentially turns into a raging torrent overnight. The water levels rise drastically, the current accelerates, and it simply tears the Austro-Hungarian logistical network apart. The flood waters violently rip away the wooden pontoon bridges that the Austro-Hungarians had painstakingly built to cross the river.
It creates a logistical nightmare that is almost hard to fathom. Suddenly, you have tens of thousands of Austro-Hungarian soldiers who have crossed the river, fighting fiercely against the Italians. But they look behind them, and their bridges are gone. The river is impassable.
They are completely hopelessly trapped. They cannot receive artillery ammunition, they cannot receive food or fresh water, they cannot evacuate their mounting thousands of wounded soldiers, and most terrifyingly, they cannot retreat. They are pinned between a heavily armed, highly motivated Italian army, utilizing defense in depth on one side, and a raging, flooded river on the other. They are sitting ducks.
The Italian artillery commanders realize exactly what has happened. They stop firing at the Austrian infantry and focus every gun they have on the river crossings, blasting any attempt by the Austrian engineers to rebuild the bridges. The slaughter on the riverbanks is absolute carnage. The historical sources grimly note that as the Italian counterattacks those mobile reserve divisions Diaz had kept ready in the trucks finally swept forward, thousands of panicked Austro-Hungarian soldiers drowned in the flooded waters of the Piave, trying to swim back to the eastern bank to escape the slaughter.
The battle is a decisive, annihilating victory for Italy. The Austro-Hungarians are completely pushed back across the river by June 23rd.
And the cultural footprint of this battle is massive. It's famous for a few incredible pop culture cameos that really anchor it in the 20th century consciousness. For instance, there was an 18-year-old American volunteer working for the Red Cross, driving an ambulance on the Italian front during this period. He gets caught in the fighting and gets severely wounded by an exploding Austrian trench mortar shell, taking dozens of pieces of shrapnel to his legs. He survives, falls in love with his nurse in the Milan hospital, and uses the profound trauma of the Italian front to write one of the greatest novels of the 20th century. That 18-year-old was Ernest Hemingway, and the experience directly inspired A Farewell to Arms.
It's a prime example of how the visceral reality of this war birthed the modern literary movement. We also see the intersection of war and early mass propaganda. The famous Italian nationalist poet Gabriele D'Annunzio took to the skies shortly after the battle. He actually flew a daring, long-range airplane mission all the way over the Austrian capital of Vienna. But he didn't drop bombs. He dropped hundreds of thousands of propaganda leaflets, written in Italian and German, mocking the Austrian defeat at the Piave and praising the invincible spirit of the Italian army. It was a massive psychological blow to an already crumbling empire.
You can feel that soaring, desperate Italian morale in the artifacts left behind on the battlefield. I was reading about the graffiti scrawled by the Italian soldiers. On the ruined walls of bullet-pocked, destroyed rural farmhouses along the river, these peasant conscripts wrote mottos in charcoal and paint that are still preserved in museums today. My absolute favorite, which encapsulates the entire spirit of the Italian defense, reads, "It is better to live one single day as a lion than 100 years as a sheep." You can literally hear the fierce defiance, the absolute refusal to break in those words.
That defiance held the line, but it came at a terrible cost to the attackers. This raises an important question, one that historians grapple with constantly. How much of global history is decided not by grand strategy or diplomatic maneuvering, but by sheer, total, physiological and psychological exhaustion?
That's a profound thought.
The Second Battle of the Piave River wasn't just a military defeat. It was the structural and spiritual death of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They suffered nearly 120,000 casualties in just over a week. They expended the absolute last reserves of their artillery ammunition and food. The morale of their soldiers was completely obliterated. The diverse nationalities within their army, the Czechs, the Poles, the Hungarians, the Croats, finally realized the empire was doomed and began actively fracturing, with entire units refusing orders or deserting.
The realization of that collapse echoed all the way up the chain of command, right to the very top of the Central Powers.
It did. When Erich Ludendorff, the supreme commander of the German military, who was currently bogged down in his own failing offensives in France, received the telegraph detailing the absolute disaster at the Piave River, his reaction was chilling. He later wrote in his memoirs that upon hearing the news, he had the sensation of defeat for the first time. The sheer scale of the Austro-Hungarian collapse made it mathematically clear to the German high command that the war was lost. They no longer had an ally. They had a collapsing corpse tethered to their southern flank. The Austro-Hungarian army essentially disintegrated a few months later at the Battle of Vittorio Veneto, and the First World War ended shortly after.
It is an incredible, sprawling, terrifying narrative. Let's take a deep breath and synthesize the immense ground we've covered today, because it has been a massive journey. We started our deep dive by looking at the very first naval airstrikes in human history, launched from primitive seaplane carriers against a besieged, isolated German colony on the coast of China.
We covered so much.
We then traveled to Europe to witness the freezing, chaotic, blind cat-and-mouse breakouts in the blinding winter fogs of Poland, where armies moved by train and fought with unloaded rifles. We examined the horrifying societal collapse, starvation, and ethnic violence inside a polyglot fortress in the east, and mourned the 800,000 men who froze to death trying to save it. We explored the desperate, highly engineered subterranean cities carved out of chalk by New Zealanders beneath the mud of France, where new infantry tactics clash with the brutal logic of defense in depth. And finally, we ended with the flooded, raging rivers of Italy, washing away the pontoon bridges, the logistics, and ultimately the final remnants of a centuries-old European empire.
It's a lot to process.
When you take a step back and look at the First World War through these 5 distinct, incredibly detailed lenses, it completely shatters the illusion of a single, uniform war of static trenches. It was not one type of conflict. It was a fluid, terrifying, global laboratory of human endurance, rapid technological adaptation, and military science.
It absolutely was. And looking at the sheer friction that defined every single one of these engagements, I want to leave you with a lingering concept to mull over long after you finish listening. We've seen today how meticulous military manuals, beautifully drafted railway timetables, perfectly synchronized creeping artillery barrages, and grand imperial strategies constantly inevitably fell apart the exact moment they met reality. Whether that friction was an unexpected squall of snow at Uras, a freezing fog bank in Poland, a suddenly flooded river in Italy, or simply the absolute limit of human exhaustion and starvation in Przemysl, the plan never survives contact with the environment.
Never.
So it makes you wonder, in our modern era right now, where we rely so heavily on hyper-advanced predictive algorithms, satellite intelligence, AI targeting, and remote drone warfare, have we actually eliminated that friction? Or are we arrogantly fooling ourselves? Are modern military still just one unexpected extreme weather event, one flooded river, or one massive communications blackout away from experiencing the exact same chaotic, uncontrollable collapse of the plan that those soldiers experienced a century ago?
Wow. That is an incredibly sobering, chilling thought to leave on. The technology of killing changes rapidly, but the fundamental chaos and friction of human conflict remains stubbornly the same. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We truly hope this journey into the fringes and extremes of the conflict has completely reframed how you view the First World War. We want you to keep asking these hard questions, stay insanely curious about the past, and always remember that history is never as simple or as neatly confined as the textbooks make it seem. Until next time.